Hi there. Today I would like to share some information with you. The title of my speech is The Heartbeat of Your Music. Imagine that you are in New Orleans in the French Quarter and you come upon this jazz combo, and the saxophone and the trombone and the trumpet, they are all soloing at the same time, it seems like. That's jazz, that's New Orleans. And you find yourself in this rush of excitement and this craziness, soloing. Sometimes there are endless solos, it seems like, in jazz. And even in the midst of that craziness, you find your foot tapping. You find your head nodding, or you're clapping along with the music. Even in the midst of endless soloing where there's no musical phrasing. Why is that? Well, the reason is mostly because of the drums. But not just any drum. One drum in particular, the snare drum. Today, I would like to inform you about the components of the snare drum and its dynamic uses that it has today in modern music. All music has a rhythm. All music, it has movement. All music is going somewhere. It has a tempo. And the foundation of that tempo is usually percussion. And today, in modern music, the foundational percussion instrument is the snare drum. The snare drum has been around for quite some time, giving it a reputation that has been tried and tried again over the periods. And it used to be used in war, so communication during war. It would tell the soldiers when to wake up, when to go to breakfast or a meal. If the enemy was coming, the drum and fife would fire up and all the soldiers would come to. So there were early uses of the snare drum even outside of music. And so the reputation of the snare drum has been around for a long time. The Vienna Symphonic Library gives us an early recorded date of 1332. Now, obviously, this isn't a picture of 1332. This is just to illustrate the use of a snare drum in war. But the Vienna Symphonic Library says as early as 1332, there was record of a snare drum being used in Switzerland. So, why the snare drum? Why is that the foundational instrument? Well, the snare drum has a sharper sound than any other drum. Here in this picture, the snare drum's in the middle, kind of showing that it rises above every other drum in terms of tone and familiarity that we have in our ears today in modern music. The tone of the snare drum is recognizable. It jumps out at you. That is what you're clapping along to. You're tapping your foot to. The snare drum has a very, very unique sound, and it rises above all the other drums. Now, the components of the snare drum, these are two pictures of snare drum. One of this one over here is exploded. The snare drum, they took a graphic design and blew, exploded the snare drum to show you all the different parts, and I know you can't read that. And here's a normal snare drum that's not exploded. And it is, as you can see, there are many components to a snare drum. It's not just a very simple instrument. It's actually more complex than most people know. So I want to share with you the components of why the snare drum has stood that test of time and is so popular today. We're going to go from the top to the bottom, all the way throughout the snare drum. The top, the skins, that's what the stick comes in contact with. And usually in a snare drum, there's two types of top skins, a battered skin and a clear skin, or head. Some people call it the head. And the battered has a really thick material that is sprayed onto it, and it lasts longer. You can hit it harder, and it is more popular than a clear top head. This drum is actually made all of it's clear. I thought it was a cool photo. So you can have clear heads or battered heads on the top. The clear ones are just more thin and more sensitive. Next, the bottom skin, that's the one that the snare actually rests on, and the bottom head is clearer, and it's almost always clear. I mean, it's thinner, almost always clear. That's what gives the crackle to the drum, is the snare rests, those metal snares rest on the bottom head there. The hardware, we'll just go from top to bottom. The hoops or the rims are these metal things on top and bottom of the snare drum, holding the skins on. And there's different types of those too. Double flanged or a normal single flanged hoop. Double flanged is stronger, and it gives a more powerful rim shot if you hit the rim. The lug casings, that's the next part of the hardware that we'll talk about. The lug casings are here in the middle of the snare drum, and they are used to hold the tension rods, which we'll talk about in the next slide, so that the tension rods can tighten around the hoop, pulling the skin, making the tone or the pitch that you want your drum to be. And the tension rods go into the hoop, down into the lug casing, and you can tighten or loosen those tension rods, pulling the skin over the beveled edge of the drum shell, or loosing it, letting it be more loose. It just depends on what kind of sound you want. So the last part of the hardware that we're going to talk about is the snare strainer and the tension bolt. So the cool thing about the snare drum is it's so dynamic, and you can use it with the snares on, touching the bottom of the head, or you can use it with the snares off, and the snares sink and they're off the drum head, giving it a hollow sound instead of a crack or a pop that you normally hear with the snare drum. Now the snare strainer is this lever right here, and you can flip it down, that drops the snares, or flip it up, and that brings the snares up. Now the tension bolt is this guy right here, and this whole instrument is mounted on the side of the drum. The tension bolt tightens or loosens the snares when it's on, so you can get a really loose or you can tighten them up and get a really tight pop. Now let's move on to the shell. The shell, there's wood shells and there's metal shells. A metal shell gives a really more aggressive, hard crack, and the wood shell is able to give a more warm sound, and it's not as aggressive, and it has a more inviting tone, not as hard. You might use a wood for the symphony, or you might use wood for jazz, and then you might use metal for hard rock or something like that. Now the actual snares, what gives the snare drum that edge, the uniqueness that it has, is the snares on the bottom. Now there's bigger ones and there's smaller ones, and depending on what sound you want, if you want a lot of crackle, you'll use a bigger band of snares. If you want a short, tight one, you'll use a smaller one. And the rattle that they produce, it's really what pushes the snare drum above any other type of drum that you hear in the music. The other thing that I would love to talk to you about is the different uses, the dynamic uses that the snare drum has today in modern music. You don't just use it for one genre. The snare drum, you don't even use them with the same sticks. You can use brushes, mallets. These are called hot rods. They're little dowel rods wrapped together, so it gives a quieter sound. So if you're playing in a coffee shop or something, you might want to use brushes or hot rods instead of traditional wooden snare sticks. The drum in all genres, the thing about the snare drum is it is so dynamic and you can use it in so many ways. The music that we listen to today, all of the genres have a snare drum in there somewhere, from the symphony to classic rock to reggae to from jazz to even DJs will synthesize a snare sound. So the snare drum is everywhere. So next time you are in New Orleans or you come upon a street band of some sort and you find your toe tapping or you're clapping along with the music, give a little credit, give a little love to the snare drum. Thank you for listening.